the Marianist as an undergraduate student at the University of Dayton, where she graduated in 2011. Sister Gabby recently completed a master's degree in theology at UD in 2019. And she's currently the research and program assistant at the North American Center for Marianist Studies, or NACMS, where she researches, teaches, and writes about Marianist history and the Marianist charism, as well as assisting with a variety of programs and helping produce NACMS's Sharing Our Marianist Stories podcast. She also shared a PowerPoint slide with me that I will include in the chat box now. It is not necessarily a follow along to this session, but it does include some important resources.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope everybody, those of you who had lunch, had a good lunch. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, everyone should be able to see that. Okay. So good afternoon, Lauren. Thank you for that brief introduction. That's so I don't have to do that for myself. It's great to be with you and have this opportunity to share a little bit related to our Marianist founders and our history and our time today. So I just wanted to let you know that the basis of this presentation is an article that I wrote for the NACMS website back in April, which was just a few months ago, but it feels like a really long time ago. A lot of things have changed since then. So in the slide, the link to the Google slide presentation that I have now, there's a link to that article. So if you would want to read that article, there's a lot more information and some resources in there as well. So I originally wrote this article because I was just so struck by all of the parallels between the challenges we were facing in our society as the pandemic unfolded and what our Marianist founders faced. I'm really blessed in my job at NACMS to spend a lot of time learning about our history, about our founders, and I always find their approaches to the crises that they faced to be very inspiring and encouraging. So I wrote this article just to share some of what I learned, hoping that you might find it helpful and inspiring. And I was fortunate to the assembly. I'm grateful for the assembly team for letting me do this presentation. So why do I title this presentation as Living Through Times of Crisis? It's in our Marianist DNA. Well, I say it's in our DNA because the Marianist family emerged from a time of crisis, in particular, the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was the biggest crisis that Europe and the Catholic Church had faced since the Protestant Reformation, really. The political, the social, and the religious upheaval that took place at that time irrevocably shaped our Marianist family. I can pretty safely say we would not exist if the French Revolution hadn't happened. So in that sense, facing times of crisis, it's in our Marianist DNA. We were made for difficult times like the ones we're facing right now. And I think because of that, we can look to our founders for wisdom about how to face these crises. So my presentation today aims to answer the question, what were these crises that our founders faced? How did they lead to and give shape to the Marianist family? And then I'm gonna leave you with some questions. What do we learn from their example? Where do we go from here in this time of COVID as a Marianist family? And then how do we as individuals, how are we called to spiritual growth? So in my presentation, I'm going to spend some time giving a little bit of historical background and reflection, but I'm also going to pose a lot of reflection questions So as we go along, I mean, you have the slides, so you can refer back to that, but I also invite you to write them down. Write down these questions. Spend some time pondering them. Talk about them in your communities. If we were in person, if all of us were together in person, I would love to do like small group sharing or pair sharing, but we're just not able to do that. So this is some reflection you're just gonna have to do on your own a little bit later. So let's start with, what are these parallels? I mentioned before that, like, I was struck and am continuously struck by the parallels between our time and the time of our founders. So what were they? Well, I don't think we can talk about our Marianist story and not talk about the French Revolution, at least a little bit. I don't want to assume that everybody knows what the French Revolution was, because to be perfectly honest with you, I really didn't know anything about it before I started formation as a Marianist sister. I guess I didn't pay attention very much in my history classes. I don't really know. I just didn't pay attention to it. I thought it was kind of boring. But it's not boring. If you look closer, it's not boring. It's actually really interesting. So what was the French Revolution? In essence, it was a decade of regime change, of social upheaval, religious persecution in France. In particular, the first few years were extremely chaotic. So in a period of 3.5 years, that's like less than an election cycle in the United States, France went from being an absolute monarchy with a king with pretty much total power to a constitutional monarchy, a king with, limited powers, to a secular republic with a dead king and a dead queen who had been guillotined by their people. 3.5 years. That's a lot of change. And especially when you think about how back then societies changed much slower than they do now, just because of how news spreads and information, that is unbelievable. But I think I want to identify a few things in particular where I see some of these parallels. Social upheaval. There were massive social changes in this time period in France. The social classes from the feudal society were abolished. So therefore the nobility, they had all of these privileges in society, and then all of a sudden, practically overnight, those privileges went away. They disappeared. And as you can imagine, the nobles really resented that. They resented this loss of privilege. This upheaval was accompanied by demonstrations by peasants who demanded justice, access to bread, an end to exploitation. Discontent was high, and fear was widespread. There was chaotic, often violent, political change and political discourse. I already mentioned how in those 3.5 years, you had 3 changes of government, and the following decade, there was no government that lasted for more than a few years. This was a nation divided between radical and traditional factions. Each side was suspicious of the other, and this tension sometimes gave way to violence. The reality of death was real and very close to people. There was so much death during this time, whether from violence, violent mobs, government militias, execution by the guillotine, or from disease and starvation that came about because of food shortages. At this time, as so often happens during chaos and instability in society, there was an economic crisis that made the price of wheat go through the roof. So a lot of the mob violence that was happening by the peasantry, it was people who were literally starving, begging for bread. In fact, it was normal at this time for people to pray for a good death, one that would be quick and painless, and to pray that you would go to heaven. And then there was separation from public worship and sacraments. During the Revolution, there was a militant secularization of French society and virulent anti-clericalism. So priests, religious, and people who helped them were forced to leave France. And if they didn't leave, they would get arrested. And often then they would be executed. The church was really seen as an enemy of the revolutionary government. Some of these priests and religious were killed by violent mobs who literally tore them limb from limb. So needless to say, it was dangerous to be a priest or a religious. But in terms of how it impacted like your average churchgoer, because of the secularization, many churches were closed, they were desecrated, lay people couldn't go to mass because so many priests had fled the country or been killed or were disgraced because they were close to the revolutionary government. So what we had at this time period was a church laity that was unable to participate in public worship, and they were unable to receive the sacraments. This was a church that was dispersed. They were cut off from each other as a community. So this picture that I've painted of the revolution, and if you looked closely at the pictures that went with the slides, hopefully that helps you see the stark similarities between their time and ours. But what about our founders? How does our Marianist story play into this or connect to this? I wanted to start this section of my presentation talking about Marie-Therese de Lamperouse, who was very important in our Marianist foundation, especially for the lay branch. She worked a lot with the Laywomen in the early Bordeaux sodality. But before I talk about her, I want to say a few words about the laity during the Revolution, especially Laywomen. I've been doing a lot of reading about this recently, and I've found some very interesting things. When we as a church, and even when we as a Marianist family, tell the history of this time period of the French Revolution, we tend to focus on the heroic actions of priests and religious, like Father Chaminade, who were indeed heroic and instrumental and so important. I'm not taking anything away from them. But what we don't realize, and the stories that don't get told, are of your average churchgoer during the Revolution, who were overwhelmingly women, especially poor women. They were the ones who, by and large, kept the faith alive. Because public worship was not possible in many places, because churches were closed and desecrated, that meant, as I said before, the faithful was dispersed. So how did people continue their Catholic faith, their sense of church community? So many Catholic women realized, okay, well, we can't go to Mass. We can't really even gather in public to pray, but we can come to each other's houses on Sunday. And we don't know how to read, but because literacy rates were not very high, especially for poor women, so we may not know how to read, but we know the rosary by heart. We remember some Bible stories. We remember stories of saints. So we can come together and we can talk about this. And that's what they did. So there's a lot of anecdotes about, poor women praying together. And that was how a generation of Catholics were raised. So the fact of the matter is the Catholic faith was kept alive, not primarily by clergy, religious, bishops, but by poor lay women, many of whom were illiterate. So a generation of Catholics who could not be baptized or receive their first communions came to know God by sitting on their mother's laps, holding rosary beads, hearing stories about Jesus and Mary and the saints. Talk about an understanding of the church as being more than a building or a leadership structure. Then you have some of these lay people, some of these lay women, decide to put their lives in danger to continue the church's ministry. And one of these was Marie-Therese de la Marousse. So during the times of the worst persecution, she helped connect priests like Father Chaminade with people who needed the sacraments, especially people who were dying. There's a lot of great stories about her that we have a lot of evidence to believe are true, that she would sneak into the local government office to find out, who was on the list of people to be arrested and probably executed. She'd sneak in there, look at the list, and then she'd leave and warn people. She took it upon herself to teach people the catechism. She led people in prayer. And when she could, she helped arrange private masses with priests that she knew who were in hiding, like Father Chaminade. So what's amazing is that at this time, when spiritual leadership by the clergy was impossible, she became a spiritual leader for Catholics who were hungering for that. So she's a perfect example of a laywoman who kept the faith alive when the public faith of the church was more hidden. And she did this because she had a strong sense of her call to live the sacrificial love of Jesus. So this image comes from Marie-Therese's house. You can visit her house today, and you can see this on a wall in her house. And it's a pretty traditional Christian image of a pelican feeding her children in times of drought. A pelican would rip their flesh, and the children would drink the blood as a way to not die of thirst. And that became kind of adopted as a Christian image. That, she would look at that. That was hanging in her house. That's that sacrificial love of Jesus. This quote by Marie-Therese, I think, demonstrates this sense of her call to that. I desire God only, his glory, his honor. Without personal interest, I offer him my entire self, my tastes, my inclinations. In a spirit of sacrifice, I offer all that can depend on my liberty, whether interiorly or exteriorly. Deign then, O God, to receive this unhappy creature. Receive her as a victim. Take possession of her. She is offering herself to you. She is sacrificing her life for love of you. When we consider the role the laity played during this time of church dispersion, is there any wonder why, when Father Chaminade returned from exile, his great plan for reviving the church started with lay people? He saw how important they are to the mission and holiness of the church. So in our time now, there are questions I think we can ask ourselves, especially you. This is a virtual lay assembly, you as Marianist laity gathered here. How do we keep our faith alive for our children, our friends, our family, and ourselves during this time when we maybe can't worship how we are used to worshiping? How are we being called to be courageous? So I turn now to Father Chaminade. Probably many more of us know Father Chaminade's story, so I'm not going to spend as much time talking about it in particular. When I look at Father Chaminade's response to the revolution and the dangers it posed to him as a priest, I'm not just struck by his actions. I'm really struck by his disposition and his spirituality, how he faced these challenges. So as I mentioned before, one of the persecutions the church faced was that all priests in France had to take an oath to the government, or they couldn't function as priests. Eventually, the ones who chose not to take the oath, the government saw them and they were like, well, they're traitors to the revolution, and they're basically like foreign infidels, so they need to leave the country, and if they stay, we're going to arrest them and maybe kill them. So Father Chaminade did not take the oath. Very famously, he refused to do that. And for the first few years after taking the oath, he went more or less into hiding. He moved where he could kind of lay low a little bit, and then was really in hiding for a while. He knew the dangers when he decided not to flee originally. He knew the dangers of staying in France for not taking the oath. One of his closest priestly mentors, Father Laywoman, was brutally murdered by an angry mob because he was a priest who didn't take the oath. So he knew very well how dangerous it was. Eventually, at a certain point, he did have to go into exile. We won't get into all the reasons for that. So he did go into exile, and that was when he went to Saragossa. And he was there for about 3 years. But during this time in Saragossa, he didn't plot revenge on the government. He didn't seethe in anger. He didn't twiddle his thumbs hoping for his fortunes to change. And he didn't, like many other priests at the time, he didn't plot ways to restore the church of old. But he thought of what's the something new that can come from this? What did he do? He prayed. He reflected. He turned to God and asked God what he should do. It was during this time that he began to understand that God was inspiring him to return to France, to again build something new, a movement of communities of lay people dedicated to Mary's mission. So after all of this pain, all of this hardship, Father Chaminade chose faith. He chose faith instead of despair, using Mary as an example, because when Mary stood at the foot of the cross, she also could have despaired. But she stood there and was faithful. I think this choice of faith is really well said in this quote from Father Chaminade. What is a faithful soul to do in the chaos of events, which seems to swallow it up? Sustain itself calmly by that faith which, assures us that all things work together unto good for those who love God. Father Chaminade wrote this as he was preparing to flee France to go to Spain. A little less than a month after he wrote this, he arrived in Zaragoza. So for us, isn't our time now a kind of exile? Haven't our lives been upended in a certain way? Maybe not the same way. We're still in our homes, but they're very different. Can this be a time of spiritual growth instead of allowing ourselves to be paralyzed by fear, anger, bitterness? Can this be a creative time? A time to pray and ask God, what is our call? What do we need to do? Who do we need to be? Oops, got ahead of me a little bit. So, Adele's story. Adele's story is a little bit different, mostly because she's younger, much younger than Father Chaminade or Marie Therese. She was born in 1789. That was a month before the Bastille prison fell, which is, many people consider the start of the French Revolution in earnest. Adele didn't know life before the French Revolution. Her early life, her early years were marked by fear of violence, instability. She didn't know a time of peace. And she would also, like Father Chaminade, experience exile with her family in Spain and in Portugal. But that was as a child. So it was a different experience. But I'm not going to talk about those aspects of Adele's life today. How she faced the revolution and her time at that point, because like I said, it was so different. I'm going to talk about her life's work being upended by illness. When the Marianist sisters started in Agen, France in 1816, it was a small group of young, vibrant, lively women. But about 3 years later, the community was flattened by tuberculosis. We think now that one of the young women who joined had tuberculosis and they didn't realize, and she brought it into the community. And then the next thing you know, almost all of them got sick with it. So now you have, for this period of time after they start, young women in their teens and 20s came into the community healthy and excited to begin their vocations. And then a few months later, they were dead. Some of Adele's best friends, some of the people who helped start the Daughters of Mary, they also died of this illness. You also have to remember that these were the days before people even knew very much about disease. So, for example, one of the common remedies for various illnesses was bloodletting. So there was this theory that illness was caused by bad blood. So if you bleed people, then that takes out some of the bad blood. Well, obviously that just made things worse. And so there wasn't a great understanding of what this was, how it was spread, what to do about it. This was before antibiotics. This was devastating to the Marianist sisters, the early sisters. And I can only imagine the temptation to despair that Adele must have felt. She had been dreaming of this foundation, feeling in her bones that God had called her to this mission to begin a new religious order. And just as it's starting, just as it's getting its feet on the ground, it's under siege by tuberculosis. I think a lot of us can probably relate to this feeling somehow. What plans were we making before the pandemic started? What were you hoping for, planning for, dreaming of that was disrupted by our new reality? The trajectory of the Daughters of Mary in the early days was completely uprooted by the sickness. In some ways, I think a lot of us can relate to that. Unfortunately, Adele would also contract tuberculosis, and it ravaged her body. She spent the last 2 years of her life pretty much in bed. She writes in some of her letters that she goes from her bed to her chair, back to her bed. That's like all the movement she could do during a day. But she never stopped working for her mission. She was like, well, I'm in bed, I'm in my chair, but I can write letters. So she wrote letters to the sisters in formation, giving spiritual guidance, leadership as best as she could. Unfortunately, this illness eventually killed her. She died at the age of 38. She was very young, just 12 years after starting the Marianist Sisters. She died well before Father Chaminade and before Marie Therese, and both of them were much older than she was. I often wonder what she would have accomplished if she hadn't fallen ill. She probably wondered that too. I'm sure she had a great sense of we could do so much more. We could do so much more. But she also realized that this project was bigger than her alone. And I think there's a lot we can learn from how she approached her illness and approached this tremendous obstacle in the sisters' foundation. Of course, she's a blessed. She's upheld as a great model of faith, but she was tempted to despair. We can read that in many of her letters. She asks her sisters to pray for her, that she doesn't fall into bitterness or into apathy or resignation. But it's clear that Adele used these trials as an opportunity to lean into God and to feel God's presence with her in every moment of difficulty, and to call out to God for help. Use these as opportunities to draw closer to God in this suffering. There was also an opportunity to lean on Mary, to cry out to her too. She writes in a letter, just a little less than 3 years before she died. It is so easy to tell the Lord that we love him when there is nothing to make us swerve from his service. Be always conscious of the presence of God. Make frequent aspirations, especially this one. My God, come to my aid. Make haste to help me. Have a great devotion to Mary and call often upon her. Adele, around this time too, she wrote often about the shortness of life and how we can't wait to do what God has asked us to do, because we never know when our time on earth is ended. And I think that our pandemic is asking us a question that we as modern Western people don't like to ask, which is the reality of our mortality, facing our own deaths. We like to think nowadays that, you know, we avoid death at all costs. But Adele's brushes with illness made her realize that the closeness of her mortality and the reality of death and how short life is. And so therefore we can't wait to begin to do the work that God is asking us to do. So I ask, what are you waiting for? What are we waiting for? What are we called to do as a Marianist family, as individuals, as communities? What are we called to do? And what are we waiting for? Are we waiting for permission? Are we waiting for reality to change? Are we waiting for ourselves to change? Maybe we can learn from Adele and realize that we can't waste time. So let's not waste this time either. So I am opening now for questions. However, if people have any questions related to this.
Okay, perfect. While the chat is being opened back up, I did want to just thank you, Sister Gabby. This was a really powerful session, and pulling these parallels from the founders is really inspiring and almost makes you feel even more deeply what the founders were feeling, and pull inspiration from that as we're going through the challenging period of time we are right now. And Rob just commented the chat box is now open. If anybody does have any thoughts or questions or comments.
Well, while people have a chance to think of some questions, I'd like to make a couple shameless plugs. That's okay.
Perfect.
They're not so shameless. Again, this is in the Google Slides presentation you have. Do you want more resources about the Marianist charism history? Go to the NACMS website. So the North American Center for Marianist Studies is available to everyone in the Marianist family connected to it. We do a lot of programming, we have publications, etc. So here's a link to our website, but we're also on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're on Twitter. So we post a lot of fun facts and quotes and information about what's going on. And we also have a podcast. So if you are a podcast listener, if my slide will change, maybe not, there we go. Check out our podcast. So that's all that I've got. Those are my shameless plugs.
Great, thank you. I'm including that link again to the PowerPoint slides in the chat, just in case any newcomers may have missed it. We have tons of praise for your presentation. I think several commenters were impacted by Adele's strength in particular. And I think we can wait another minute or so if anyone has any questions. And if not, we can move forward.
So one thing too, if the link that I posted to the paper that I wrote has citations for a lot of the information that's included in this, including like a lot of the research I've done about laywomen during the French Revolution is more recent scholarship. So if that's interesting to you, you can go to the paper and kind of look up those resources.
Gabby, we do have a question pulling from Dr. Espino's talk about thinking, will people come back to the church? What are your thoughts on what may have brought people back after the revolution, after such a time of instability?
That's a great question. I think there's a few things. I think there were many people who, I mean, that was a difficult piece. There were people who were not socialized in the church. And that was one of Chaminade's challenges, was how do we engage young adults? That's who we started with. How do we engage young adults who weren't really brought up in any kind of faith? So I think some of the movements that developed after the French Revolution, there was an explosion of religious orders, for example, who started a lot of ministry projects, teaching, missions and ministries. And I think people were struck by the outreach that the church provided. And I think that partly brought people back to the church. But I also think that you have these people, they lived through a horrific time. And at the end of that, they were seeking some real spiritual consolation. So how are we offering that to people? How are we offering a robust spirituality that is reality-based and meets people where they are, but also provides some sense of hope? So I think we need to find ways to offer that to people.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that transitions well into our next question. Speaking to you as an individual, how have you been practicing self-care during this pandemic? What's been helpful for you personally and/or professionally?
Well, I take a lot of walks. I've been working from home since this started, and so I think moving my body is really important, so that, and getting out of the house every day safely is really important. I wasn't very good at this at the beginning, but I've been working more of just using the extra time as an opportunity to grow, spend more time in prayer, surrounding myself with beauty, like music and poetry. That's also has been really feeding me. Yeah, reaching out to people, all that's good stuff.
Great, thank you. And then another question coming from a group of St. Mary's University theology grad students. They had a virtual conversation about Avery Cardinal Dewell's Models of the Church, and tried to give a model of this pandemic church. Drawing from your Marianist experience, how would you characterize the church from these last few months?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I think on the one hand, I would say fractured, which saddens me. I was disheartened by some of the discourse when the pandemic started about closing churches or not having public masses. I didn't find that very helpful. I think though, I think one of the things that we're learning related to this is maybe we need to go back to basics, which is again, the institutions and the buildings all and the leadership was so important, but there's also this sense of we are a community of people, we're the body of Christ. And so how are we as a family a church? How are we as my lay community? How are we a church? We also the church. And how can we, build something from that? I don't know. It's like sort of like a more simple, like a simplicity to it. And that's, I think we're learning to go back to the basics a little bit, which is what Father Chaminade did. I mean, when he came back to France, his primary source of inspiration was the early church. So maybe that's what we need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. And then our next question, this is a great question. How do you think lay communities can parallel the underground church of the French Revolution in a way that works both within the local church and deals with some of the polarized views of our times?
Oh gosh. I don't know. I think perseverance is a really like an important virtue.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like these Zoom meetings can be really exhausting, but they also keep us connected. So if you're in a lay community, just like persevering and finding ways to stay connected with each other and with the local church. I don't know. That's like one simple thing that I can think of off the top of my head is just like practicing that perseverance and just keep going.
Yeah, definitely. And then we've had lots of praise in the comments about Adele and her story and her strength and faith. But we have a question about Marie Therese. So what are the concrete examples that we can take away from Marie Therese's life that we can act on now, such as the home she operated in France to help prostitutes to get off the street, which channels how we can live out our faith?
I think she was constantly asking God, what now? What am I called to do right now? So when she was first invited to think about taking up the project of the Miséricorde, working with the women who were no longer prostitutes, she was repulsed by that. But she went and visited them and really prayed and reflected on it, and even had like a really interesting dream about it. And from her prayer, she was like, no, this is what God wants me to do. And I think that, you know, in times when it was really hard in the Miséricorde, when they didn't have enough food, when they didn't have enough money, it was like, okay, God, what do you want me to do? What am I called to do? And so she knocked on doors, and some people would spit on her because she was associated with prostitutes, but she kept going. So I think constantly saying to God, what am I called to do? I think is something concrete.
Yeah.
And what that is, I can't tell you. That's, you know, that's something, that's where discernment comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it speaks to the perseverance you were talking about as well.
Yeah.
I think our last question is, what are new and creative ways to look at the Eucharist without the buildings? So now that we can't gather to receive the Eucharist, what are some new and creative ways to experience that?
I think that's something we have to continue to reflect on. And that's not a cop-out answer. I think that this time is causing us to ask a lot of questions about what does presence look like when you attend Mass through a computer, for example, or some people like live stream adoration. How do we even understand how we're encountering Jesus in the Eucharist? But I think, again, I hope that maybe this is a time for us to reappreciate the sense of a mystical body of Christ, and how we are incorporated into Christ's body, which is presented in a particular way in the Eucharist. I think that's something that we lose at times. And I think that's something that was a big part of Father Chaminade's thought. So I think the Marianists can play a role in bringing that up again of the mystical body, and then the role Mary plays in that too, who birthed Christ's body, but is also like our mother in the mystical body. And so I think there's a lot there, and just in terms of our understanding. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I think there is a lively conversation happening in the chat about a more creative church. There don't seem to be any specific questions within that, but I think it is a really valuable conversation people are having, and that your presentation spurred. So thank you very much for walking us through our history as a family, and how that we can continue to pull from that and find support and comfort and strength in that today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think Katie may come on here in a minute, but that I think concludes this session. And our next speaker will be at the top of the hour.
Yep, I'm here. I did just want to say, Sister Gabby, there was a lot of acknowledgement of your talk about laywomen, and a question about if there's anything else we can read about that. I know you said you were reading and studying more. Maybe you'll be writing for us soon on this topic, but are there resources that you can point us towards at NACMS, or should we stay tuned?
Not at NACMS, but the resources that I've been reading are from like scholars of the church, like church scholars, historians. So there's a few articles I can point you to that are actually really interesting, because a lot of the counter-revolutionaries, people who protested on behalf of the church, like against the government, were women, and it's kind of interesting to read what those looked like. So I can, yeah. If you go to the paper that I wrote, like I said, there's some resources there. But they're pretty academic, but yeah, good question. I'll have to think about that more. Okay. It's a newer project, so.
Sounds good. We'll look forward to maybe drawing some of those parallels with what Hofsman Ospina was saying about needing a ministry of advocacy and a ministry of protest. So as we continue to think creatively about what our communities and our church can look like moving forward. We are getting ready to transition over. I did want to say our next session is a long session. It's a 90-minute session with Father Greg Boyle. So we're going to do a little transition right now. Jessica's going to moderate that session for us. I did want to say a special thank you to our Zoom supporters this morning behind the scenes. We've had Sarah Gray, who also is our paid staff at MLC-NA and MSJC. This assembly, I assure you, could not have been possible without her. It has been so great to have someone who we are actually paying to do some of the work and take some of the just some of the administrative tasks off the hands of our volunteers. So thank you to Sarah, who was our Zoom support this morning. And then we've had Rob Broderick, who is moderating the last two sessions and the next session. And then finally this afternoon, Brother Mark Motes, who will be offering Zoom support for the final 3 sessions today. So our thanks to them for keeping things running smoothly. I think it has been going pretty smoothly, and they're providing a huge, huge support for us. Also encouraging anyone else who can become proficient at Zoom to do so. I think this platform is here to stay. We're looking for other folks who will be able to help us do that behind the scenes, really important work to keep things running smoothly. Again, just a reminder that tomorrow's sessions, we will be focusing on our MLC-NA business meeting. We also will be hearing from Brother Bernie Plager on an update on the SM direction statements and next steps. Many of us participated in the regional gatherings as a part of providing input to those direction statements. And then we will have the Dayton Marianist Family Council. We are really, really watching our family councils kind of come back to life in the regions. And we're looking at that as a structure where we'll be able to do regional work moving forward. So if you're on a regional family council and you want to hear about the great work that the Dayton Marianist Family Council is doing, Brother Ray Fitz and a number of the leadership team from that family council will be here with us tomorrow. And then a final reminder that via Facebook Live, we'll have the closing mass, Holy Rosary Parish, and the pastor, Father John Thompson, will be welcoming us to join their community. So that's what we have ahead for tomorrow. Do we have Father Greg signed on yet?